So my entire channel and today's presentation is about the New Deal, which was a series of relief, recovery, and reform programs that happened in the 1930s, created by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to deal with the problems from the Great Depression. And the New Deal had three pieces: relief, recovery, and reform. Today I'm going to talk about the reform part, and specifically about Glass Steagall, which were a series of reforms that was created by Roosevelt in order to address the problems with the United States financial system and banking. I'm doing this from in quarantine. It is the great Coronavirus quarantine of 2020, and I don't have anything else to do, so I might as well talk about financial reform. So the reforms I'm going to talk about are something that I think we could use today. The Glass Steagall Act was overturned in the early 2000s. I think that was a mistake, and I think it is probably, or something like it, in the next few years, is probably going to be passed again because there is no other option. People are not going to suffer tremendously while financiers become billionaires, and the entire bailout system's a mess. Anyway, that is what this presentation is about. I did I used all my artistic skills in a wonderful PowerPoint presentation about Glass Steagall. This stuff is kind of hard to explain, or maybe I'm just a bad communicator. I don't know, but I'm trying to use any tools I have available to get the general public to understand what the problem is and what are the solutions that I would propose for it. The Glass Steagall Act is about the two basic types of banking. The two basic types of banking are commercial banking, and that's where the bank takes in deposits, takes in money into checking accounts and savings accounts. And then the bank lends out money to small businesses through small business loans and corporations through corporate loans. The other type of banking is investment banking, and that's underwriting corporate stocks and bonds and trading in securities, like trading in stocks, trading in bonds, doing that kind of thing. And these days, a lot of investment banking has more to do with trading in derivatives. So during the past, investment banking was primarily about buying and selling stock. For instance, in the 1920s, investment banks bought and sold shares in companies, and they helped and the general public did the same thing. They buy on margin, meaning they'd only had to put a percentage of the money up front. That works great when the market is going up. When the stocks are gaining money, that's no problem. However, when the market starts to go down, that can create immediate and catastrophic losses. Today, investment banking primarily deals with OTC derivatives, over-the-counter derivatives. And what is an OTC derivative? An OTC derivative is simply an agreement between two parties and is a type of private contract that creates a new security. The easiest way to think about what an OTC derivative is, it's just a bet. If you make a bet with someone, you can put in any types of stipulations into that bet. Las Vegas has all kinds of different games that are different structures for betting, in the same way that OTC derivatives have all kinds of different structures for betting. A bet is also just an agreement between two parties. If I play roulette, I can bet on red against the casino. This is the exact same structure as a derivative. I am one of the parties in the contract, and the casino is the other party in the contract. And it is important to mention this is a private contract. It's not listed on an exchange like the stock exchange. It's just simply an agreement between two parties. So it's important to understand the difference between a stock and a derivative. If I buy a pro basketball team and that team that has a great season, they win a majority of their games, they win the playoffs, I'll probably make more money because my basketball team is now worth more money. They'll sell more tickets, they'll sell more merchandise. So if I spend $1 million on that team, it's probably worth, I could sell my team for $1.4 million now. However, a derivative is basically much more like a bet. So I could go out and I could take my $1,000,000 I was going to spend to buy my winning basketball team, and as opposed to buying the team, I just simply start betting the games. I don't actually own the team, I just have a counterparty somewhere. And in the case of betting on a basketball team, that would be called a bookie. And I could put money on my basketball team for each one of those games. And at the end of the season, if they had a really good season, and I bet those games, then I would probably make more money on the betting than I would on owning the team. It'd be just fine if investment banking made bets that they had the money to cover. So if the investment bank is out there and they're betting all over the place, that's great, as long as they have the money to cover it. But history is full of examples of banks not being able to cover these losses and going out of business. So what generally happens is when the market goes up, it's easy to make a good bet. When housing prices are rising, it's hard to make a bad bet in housing. So you just keep making larger and larger and larger bets. But eventually, housing is going to drop. And when it does, you're extended because you've made so many large bets that now you can't cover your bets. So that's what happened during the 2008 financial crisis, when these banks had created collateralized debt obligations and credit default swaps to basically invest in mortgages. So these CDOs were designed around mortgage payments. When that stopped, the CDOs lost value. The banks had all kinds of trouble covering these losses, and they began to fail. Commercial banking, as opposed to investment banking, provide one of the infrastructures to create a society and other services. There are things that banks do that are absolutely vital to the function of a society or even civilization. And so banks, one of the services that is key that banks provide, a society needs an infrastructure to store value or store money. They need some way that they can store this value. And that is one thing a bank provides. Just like an infrastructure to provide water and electricity, this is one of the things that we need for a civilized society. So banks are very, very important because they're providing a service that is almost like a utility. Just as a storage facility's job is to store a customer's valuable physical items, there we go, got all the valuable physical items in there. It is the commercial bank's job to store our valuable financial items. So I've got my checking account with my living expenses, I got my kids' college money in the bank, I've got an account with my retirement money, and I've got a savings account that has 10 years income from digging ditches. So I've been digging ditches for 10 years, I put the money in the bank. Commercial banks have a long history of being exceptionally horrible at this job of storing financial items, storing value, because they lose money in investment banking. And that's what happened during the Great Depression. The commercial bank would start to lose money. Everyone would become nervous because the bank might lose their money, and they'd run to the bank to get their money out. This was called a bank run. So investment banking, or investment banks, wanted to make bets in the same businesses that house the commercial banks. So basically, if you had investment banks combined with commercial banks, it had some very terrible consequences. So if the investment bank made a bad decision, for instance, they bet on the housing market, so they bet on these, they created these collateralized CDOs, they bought CDOs, collateralized debt obligations, and then the housing market failed, it could horribly affect the commercial banking part of the bank. The bank loses, then you lose. So basically, it's in the same pot of money that your living expenses, retirement money, everything's in. And if the bank goes out of business, you might lose everything. And if people feel like they're going to lose everything, they're going to have a bank run. And if they start having a bank run, they lose faith in the financial system, then you end up with a depression, like the Great Depression. So because this happened during the Great Depression, the government needed to fix the problem. And there have been many depressions before the Great Depression. The Great Depression shocked the system enough that in order for capitalism to survive in America, they had to figure a fix to this problem because people needed to eat, and they weren't going. They understood that there was some kind of problem in the financial system. So Carter Glass and Henry Steagall got together and they created the Glass Steagall Act. So the Glass Steagall Act separated commercial and investment banking. If an investment bank failed, it was a separate business from the commercial bank. Its finances were in no way connected to a commercial bank, and the commercial bank's money, and that way the commercial bank could remain stable. The investment bank would go out of business, and the commercial bank would stay in business, and that way people would feel secure about that their money in the commercial bank was would still be there, and it would stop bank runs. That was important because another part of the Glass Steagall Act, so here's investment activity and commercial bank, the Glass Steagall Act separated the two. And the Glass Steagall Act worked great from 1933 to around 2000, 1999, 2000, 2001. And a series of legislation basically overturned the Glass Steagall Act. Called Graham Beach Bliley and the Securities Modernization Act. That's what overturned the Glass Steagall Act. But the Glass Steagall Act did pretty well. So we had 67 years without a serious financial calamity. We had some minor things, but nothing was the size of the Great Depression. We didn't have another major shock to the system. The Glass Steagall Act also separated insurance from both commercial and investment banking. And this is very important too, because imagine in the event of a natural disaster, if a hurricane was to hit North Carolina, a lot of people need to make insurance claims. They need the insurance company to basically give them money to rebuild their houses and rebuild their businesses because they've been destroyed by the hurricane. Do you want that money coming out of the same businesses, though, that also are doing their commercial banking? So they're going to need to pull money also out of their checking and savings accounts because they're probably going to need money to live on in the meantime. In this way, it was just smart to separate insurance from commercial and investment banking. And it also kept companies smaller. The same company that was doing insurance couldn't be doing commercial banking and couldn't be doing investment banking, which made the entire system more stable. In addition, Glass Steagall created depository insurance from the FDIC. So the banks the general public could feel safe that their money that their checking and savings accounts wouldn't disappear if the bank went out of business because it was insured by the government. And it was important, even more important then, to separate commercial and investment banking, because you did not want the investment banking out there making very risky bets if it was in the same institution that was being insured by the government. You didn't want it having access to money that was being insured by the government. But of course, the banking industry did not like Glass Steagall. They complained and complained and complained, and they were very sad about Glass Steagall. They were sad that they could not mix investment banking and commercial banking at the same time. And the sad bankers came up with many creative arguments as to why we shouldn't have Glass Steagall. The biggest one was free markets. Why should the government be able to tell me how to run my business? I'm a job creator. I am John Galt. Atlas Shrugged. Alan Greenspan. And also another argument was the City of London can do it. In other words, the banking sector in the City of London, Wall Street competes heavily, New York competes heavily with another financial hub, which is the City of London. And in London, this was not a problem. So Wall Street was arguing that they should be able to do it too in order to compete. Banks argued that the market would regulate their activity. In other words, if they did something stupid, the market would put them out of business. And there's no reason that we should do anything to tell banks how they should do banking. The government should not be able to tell an honest, hardworking banker what to do. He might not be able to innovate and thus feed his children. And it says these kids are hungry because it says my dad would be able to feed us if he could just combine his investment bank buying OTC derivatives with commercial banking. Sadly, he can't combine investment and commercial banking, and thus his children go hungry. Banks argue that banks should be treated just like any other business. It's not the government's responsibility to tell bankers what to do. They were just like apple farmers. So if an apple farmer wanted to compete in the market, he could say, I grow the tastiest apples, so everyone's going to buy my apples. Just as the banker says, I grow the tastiest OTC derivatives on the market. And if that's true, then they'll both do well in the market. So we'll just let the free market decide. The problem is that banking is very, very different than apple farmers. Banking affects the general public in a way that apple farmers do not. And if something goes bad with an apple farmer, for instance, his apples aren't very tasty. Oh no, my apples are horrible. Then no one wants to buy his apples, and the apple farmer could easily go out of business. And it doesn't affect the general public. They just say, okay, better luck next time. Now, if you compare this to something like a munitions maker, say you have a business that supplies munitions to the military, and they're really, really bad at their jobs. They make bad munitions. They make bad bombs. Their bombs are faulty. And a faulty bomb is a dangerous thing because it could blow up and hurt everyone. So in this scenario, the government has to be involved more. This bomb maker says, this munitions maker says, oh no, my bombs are faulty. I am going out of business. Well, if we have a business that, like a munitions maker, that's not doing a very good job in their business, it could, we could have all kinds of dangerous explosions and effects on the general public. And the banker is more like the munitions maker, because if the banker makes a mistake, oh no, my OTC derivative failed because of the housing market crash that I caused, I'm going out of business. Unless the government gives me money. And in this case, the banker could cause a depression. So the banker, unless we give him money, the result will be that we might not have jobs, and we might not have an economy, and we might not have money in the bank. So in order to stop that, we have to give the banker money to keep him in business. After 1933, the Glass Steagall Act, banks were smaller. And even if the bank failed, the general public would be more protected. However, once the Glass Steagall Act was repealed, the banks became too large, and a bank failure would seriously harm the general public. So banks received public money to stay in business even if they failed or made a mistake. And this is what happened in 2008. They made a mistake, but they got taxpayer money, government money, so they could stay in business. So banks could now break the law and take as much risk as they wanted because the public would always bail them out. This created a new era of banking problems because banks could break the law with impunity. And we saw this all over the place. The last major banking prosecutions were in the early 2000s, shortly after the Glass Steagall Act was passed. So for the last 10 years, there have not been any major prosecutions of bankers or even large corporations. Everything is too big to fail. And the end of Glass Steagall created a system that bankers loved called too big to fail, too big to jail. So banks could not fail. They could not lose money because even if they made a mistake, the general public would have to bail them out. And because they couldn't lose money, they could actually started to commit bigger and bigger crimes. Banking spun out of control. And bankers would argue that too big to fail doesn't exist. But unfortunately, there's even a doctrine called the Holder Doctrine. Attorney General Eric Holder, who was part of the Obama administration, had a memo saying that he created a memo saying that he would not prosecute banks because if the bank failed, it could cause systemic risk and affect the entire system. In other words, he didn't want to cause a recession or a depression by actually prosecuting banks for committing crimes. So when we talk about too big to fail, there's one bank in particular, and there's plenty of examples of too big to fail, banks breaking the law and then getting away with it, or the old situation, steal $1 billion, pay $1 million. And this goes to a lot of different banks. It's not just Wells Fargo, but Wells Fargo has really set themselves up as sort of the poster boy for too big to fail. Wells Fargo is great at finding new and interesting ways to steal money from people. And if you remember, let's get a little history on Wells Fargo, first of all. So Wells Fargo had to pay $2.9 billion for actions that contributed to the 2008 financial crisis. And they did a lot of different things. It's so hard to narrow down all the Wells Fargo scandals because they've had so many. They just keep breaking the law and breaking the law and breaking the law. So if you remember, Glass Steagall was repealed back in around the turn of the century. 2000, 2001 was when Glass Steagall was repealed. So they had to pay from the federal. They basically, between the Federal Housing Administration, they had to pay the federal this fine because they insured risky mortgages. They got the Federal Housing Administration into insuring risky mortgages that were ineligible for federal support between 2001 and 2008. So that contributed to their first fine, which is $2.09 billion. And that was a fine for the 2008 financial crisis. Now remember, a significant contributing factor to the 1929 market crash was high borrowing by the insurers and banks. This was before the time that they were securitizing anything. It was basically just stock. That was what was in the original 1929 market crash. So a significant contributing factor to the 1929 market crash was high borrowing by the issuers and banks, and high risk-taking by the investors. The 2008 failure was due to high borrowing by issuers and borrowers, as well as high risk-taking by the banks and brokerages and underwriting firms. So basically, it was the same thing. They took a lot of risk that they shouldn't have taken. And it happened in 1929, and it happened in 2008. And those were times that Glass-Steagall, that was before the Glass Steagall Act and after the Glass Steagall Act was repealed. So in this instance, Wells Fargo is being grilled by Senator Elizabeth Warren. And they're being grilled because what Wells Fargo got caught doing was cross-selling. So basically what they were saying was the practice that was underpinning the fraud is that they were trying to sell multiple products to consumers. For instance, a consumer might come in and wanting a checking account. They'd be encouraged to take out a mortgage and set up a credit card line or online banking account. They were offering them an array of financial products. But what they weren't telling them, that they were giving them the financial products, whether they liked it or not. So you come in for one thing and they open up a bunch of fraudulent accounts. And when I say a bunch of fraudulent accounts, to be exact, despite all the stuff that they'd gone through in 2008, being fined and all the rest of that, the bank was fined $185 million in early September 2016, totally September 2016, due to the creation of 1.5 million unauthorized accounts and 500,000 credit card accounts. So basically, you'd come in for one thing and they'd secretly open up a bunch of accounts on the side that you would end up having to pay fees for and money be transferred into without your knowledge, and it just turned into it was a big fraudulent mess. Later estimates, by May 2017, they placed the total number of accounts that Wells Fargo had opened to 3.5 million. So even the first shockingly large estimate was only around half of what they ended up of the total number of fraudulent accounts. They opened as many as 1.5 million checking and saving accounts and more than 500,000 credit cards accounts. And this is what too big to fail looks like this is basically, you can't get a better example of too big to fail. This is the CEO of Wells Fargo testifying in front of Congress, and he's being questioned by Elizabeth Warren.
Says, quote, "We believe in values lived, not phrases memorized. If you want to find out how strong a company's ethics are, don't listen to what its people say, watch what they do." So let's do that. Since this massive years-long scam came to light, you have said repeatedly, quote, I am accountable. But what have you actually done to hold yourself accountable? Have you resigned as CEO or chairman of Wells Fargo?
The board, I serve at
Have you resigned?
No, I've not.
All right. Have you returned one nickel of the millions of dollars that you were paid while this scam was going on?
Well, first of all, this was by 1% of our people,
That's not my question. My question is about responsibility. Have you returned one nickel of the millions of dollars that you were paid while this scam was going on?
the board will take care
Have
of that.
you returned one nickel of the money you earned while this scam was going on?
And the board will do.
I will take that as a no then. Have you fired a single senior executive? And by that, I don't mean a regional manager or branch manager. I'm asking about the people who actually led your community banking division or your compliance division.
We've made a change in our regional to lead our regional bank.
I just said, I'm not asking about regional managers. I'm not asking about branch managers. I'm asking if you have fired senior management, the people who actually led community banking division.
So that was a great moment. I enjoyed that a lot, where Elizabeth Warren was grilling this guy who was the CEO of Wells Fargo, and you'll notice that he didn't take any responsibility whatsoever. This is a prime example of too big to fail. So let's review quickly. This was the scandal where what he was testifying about was the 3.5 million fraudulent accounts that were opened. Those accounts were opened under his watch, and they were opened because there was a lot of pressure put on low-level employees. I will guarantee you that if any of those tellers had gone in there and grabbed a pile of 20s and ran out the door, they would be in jail right now. But this guy can do that 3.5 million times and still remain CEO of Wells Fargo, as how can all the other executives. This fraud is not a bug in the system. This fraud is the system. And Wells Fargo proved that again and again and again. Even after this happened in 2016, by 2018, new allegations against Wells Fargo were being reported. Who could have guessed? Including signing unwitting customers for unnecessary auto insurance. So they did sign people up for unnecessary credit cards. Why not do the same thing with auto insurance? And then they had problems with their financial advisors doing some illegal things shortly after that. The latest scandal with Wells Fargo, and I know this is going to blow your mind, is the Paycheck Protection Program, where the federal government was giving money to small businesses. Well, how did that money get to the small businesses? It went through banks, and one of those banks, you're not going to believe it, was Wells Fargo. So Wells Fargo did what Wells Fargo always does. They looked out for the bottom line in Wells Fargo. And guess what happened? Now, because of the way the money was distributed, Wells Fargo is getting sued once again. This not only shows that Wells Fargo is too big to jail, the Holder Doctrine, what was created by Eric Holder back in 2012, basically says we're not going to do this. We're not going to prosecute banks. It also shows the reason that you need a national bank, because the money that was distributed from through the Paycheck Protection Program ended up with all types of lawsuits. But the bailout for the American people, the $1,200 checks went through the IRS, no problem, got to the American people. Why do we need these banks, these criminal enterprises that are continually stealing from us? Okay, this is a great article in Salon, and it is from one of my absolute favorite writers, Nomi Prinz. It's an article that came out relatively recently, April 11th. And it's about how much of the money that, how much of the relief money in 2020 relief money actually got to the American people versus how much went to the bank. And it says in this article, in total, the CARES Act that Congress passed offers $2.2 trillion in government relief, as President Trump noted, while signing it into the law. However, total government coronavirus aid could reach $6.2 trillion. That's a staggering sum. Unfortunately, you won't be surprised to learn that given both the Trump administration and the Fed, that story hardly ends there. more than 4 trillion of the estimate is predicted on of that estimate is predicted on using 454 billion of CARES Act money to back federally reserve-based corporate loans. The Fed has the power to leverage or multiply money it receives from the Treasury up to 10 times over. In the end, according to the president, that means that $4.5 trillion is in support for big banks and corporate entities. And that's versus 1.4 trillion for regular Americans, small businesses, hospitals. That's 3.5 to 1. So for every dollar we get, they're going to get 3.5. And if that doesn't show too big to fail, I don't know what does. A lot of these banks were they did the exact same thing they did back in 2008. In 2008, it was collateralized debt obligations. Today, it's collateralized loan obligations. But we are throwing money at these banks to keep them in business, and there's absolutely no reason for it. They were too big. Again, it's the same story.